Welcome to the Fort Bridger Trading Post. This trading post was established in 1843 by Jim Bridger. And Jim Bridger was what we would consider one of our first M, which is the Mountain Man eras. If you know the fort here, we have 5 M's. And the Mountain Men were the first group of people here at the fort. They were actually out here for about 20 years before the fort was established. So they were out here trapping beaver and staying out here, and then they would send the beaver furs back east to the people who wanted to use them to make hats with. 2 things happened to put the Mountain Men kind of out of business. Number one, they had done such a good job of trapping the beaver that they had basically killed them all off. There were no more beaver for them to trap. And the second portion was that the fashion of the beaver hats had gone out of style back east, and they don't really want the beaver anymore because they didn't need it to make their hats. So at that point, the Mountain Men were out here and they needed a new way to make some money. Some of them did go back east. They didn't really like it. They wanted to stay out here. These were rugged men who wanted to stay out in the wilderness by themselves. Some of them created ferries. Some of them continued trying to be mountain men, only not trapping beaver. And others, like Jim Bridger, created a trading post for those people who did stay out here collecting furs or whatever. And so Jim Bridger, he established this fort here with his friend Louis Vasquez. And some really fortunate piece for Jim Bridger is that the year he established the fort was the year that the very first large wagon train was coming from the east on the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail didn't really exist at that time, so there wasn't really a specific route that they were taking. So Jim Bridger was able to intercept them way out there about 100 miles away and tell them that he had a fort here with a blacksmith shop, so they could come and buy supplies and get repairs done to their wagons at the blacksmith shop. And this was the only one in about, 500 miles that they could stop at. So if you think about that, people were really motivated to come down here because this was the only place where you could get those things done. At the same time as those people were coming through, there were also mountain men who were out here trying to do the trade. And some of the things that they might do or they might use is this right here. It does have a sign on it, but this is called a fur press. So if you can guess maybe what a fur press is, you would use it for our fur pieces. So one of the things, if you were a trapper, you would have a lot of furs. But trying to transport these furs back east, you can't just have a bunch of them kind of just loose like this. You would need a way to get them packaged up so that you could load them onto a donkey or a horse or something and get them back east. Like I said, at that time the trails didn't really exist, so wagons weren't necessarily something that those fur traders could have used in the beginning. They were largely putting them onto donkeys or horses and then carrying them out and trying to get them to maybe a river or something where they could get them on a boat and get them off. So what they would need to do is somehow pack these furs into the best way so they could load them. And what they would use is a fur press. Now this is a very rustic fur press. If you go to some of the bigger forts out here, they have pieces that are giant metal things and they could spin it with a crank. This one you could just cut some trees down, put it together, and actually use it as a fur, as a kind of a rustic piece. Well, what they would do is they would take your furs, you would stack them on the thing, and then you would take this piece, this crossbar, you would chain one end down to the ground, and then you would use this to press it down into a giant bale. So it'd get really tight. They would wrap it in like a deer skin to kind of protect the fur, and then they would tie it together. And you'd have these giant bales of fur that you could then load onto a horse. Most of the bales ended up being about 100 pounds. So you would have a pretty big pile of furs that you would stack, and then they could load it onto a donkey and get it out of here. One of the things when you're trapping animals, you don't generally have nice fur like this. Obviously, you have to clean it and get it all ready. And one of the things that they would use for that purpose is this. Now, you can kind of guess maybe what this is. I get a lot of people who guess it's a hula hoop. That's not the case. This is actually called a hide stretch. So after you skin the animal and you have the fur, you need to dry it out and clean it. And what they would do is they would tie the individual pieces to a round piece like this and then hang it out, and it would dry up so that they could then have nice pieces so that they could stack and put them in the bale. And then they might have hundreds of these actually lined up in some of the busy places where you have lots of furs that you're trying to process and get ready to go back east. So those mountain men who were out here, this is basically what they were doing. They could come here to the fort and sell their wares and buy new supplies for them to head out back into the wilderness and do some further trapping. Most of those people, they didn't spend a lot of time with people, but there was one time a year when they would come in, and that was usually in late July, and they would have a special event. I don't know if you guys know what that event is called, if you think about it. We have one here every year. It's called a rendezvous. And the rendezvous was the one time a year when all of the trappers from all over would come together, and they would trade their furs to the people coming from the east who would have the supplies. And then they would stay for a couple of weeks as traders and trappers were coming in. They could hang out, they could tell stories about their adventures over the winter and hang out with everybody. And then after those 2 weeks, everybody would go back to their original locations. They go back to trapping, or they would take the furs back east. And then wait another year, and then they would come back out, and they would do that all over again. So this is the only time at the rendezvous was really the only time when those people could get together. So that's basically the mountain man life.